Welcome to Section 6, Services and Service Equipment. It is your responsibility to understand and apply all requirements of the Canadian Electrical Code Part 1, including those not addressed in the training. Do you want to know how to take this course?
Hi, I'm Roy, your subject matter professional for this learning. I will help you to understand and be able to apply the requirements of the section of the Canadian Electrical Code, Part 1.
The aim of this training is to provide new knowledge and to support the development of new skills that you can apply immediately to your job. The purpose is why you are taking this learning. To directly support the purpose, this learning has identified objectives. Here is what you will learn as you take this training. This training is divided into topics. These topics build on each other, so a best practice is to review them in the order they are presented. Save or print a copy of the Quick Reference Guide. It is located in Resources. Use this Quick Reference Guide to take notes and as a practical job aid for this code section.
Section 6 sets the requirements for both low-voltage and high-voltage consumer service and metering equipment connected to a supply authority's distribution system. High-voltage installations are further modified by Section 36. What the code does not cover is the supply authority's distribution equipment. As you know, the code includes key terms in Section 0 in the definition subsection. Hover over the 5 terms for more information to help you to apply requirements in Section 6. Supply authorities are sometimes referred to as electric utilities, wire owners, local distribution companies, municipal utilities, distributors, transmitters, etc. Some supply authorities may own and operate electrical power production facilities as part of their electrical power network operations and be deemed to be utilities by the regulatory authority having jurisdiction. Supply service are conductors that exist in both overhead or underground configurations. They can be installed by the customer initially or the supply authority. However, the ownership, final connection, and maintenance are done by the supply authority. Consumer service includes equipment such as the service disconnecting means, service over current protection, and conductors. For an overhead service, the point of connection by the supply authority occurs at the point where the conductors emerge from the service head. For an underground service, the point of connection by the supply authority could occur at multiple locations. This includes at the service disconnecting means, the meter base, or supply transformer. In many residential and small commercial applications, the service box is combined with the panel board to form a combination panel. The service box is typically distinguished by a separate cover over the main breaker. Fusible disconnects and breaker enclosures must be approved for use as service entrance equipment when used as the service box. A service room must also meet the requirements for working space and entrances or exits in accordance with Sections 2 and 6. Here is a short activity to apply what you just learned. Enter your response and select Submit. Are you wondering what is and is not included in consumer service equipment? The separation point is service equipment located between the supply authority's distribution equipment and the consumer's distribution equipment. This operational demarcation point is usually the main disconnecting device on the customer's premises that separates the connection of the customer's facility or building from the supply authority's distribution system. To facilitate the needs of the supply authority and the consumer, Rule 6-200, Item 1 requires that each consumer service terminate in a single service box. The consumer service refers to the portion of the consumer's installation from the service box, or its equivalent, up to and including the connection point of the supply authority. The consumer service, which includes conductors, provisions for metering equipment, and the service disconnect, brings electrical energy into the installation. It can then be distributed through distribution equipment to the feeders and individual branch circuits to meet the electrical requirements of the consumer. The code sets requirements for the installation of service equipment in either Section 6 or Section 36. So when do you use Section 6 requirements? For electrical installations operating at 750 volts or less, and to the supply authority's indoor and outdoor lines and distribution equipment, when these lines and equipment are on private property, for the connection of consumer services and service equipment. And when do you use Section 36 requirements? For electrical installations operating at voltages in excess of 750 volts. Time for an activity. Choose your response and then select Submit. The code is very clear on the number of supply services permitted. A single building is to only have one supply service except for fire pumps, industrial establishments, complex structures, or self-contained occupancies not located one above the other and each with ground-level outside access. If two supply services are installed to a building, the service boxes must be grouped where practicable, or have diagrams on or near each service box indicating the location of other service equipment. The code is also very clear on the maximum number of consumer services permitted in or on a building. Rule 6-104 requires that no more than 4 consumer services be connected to any supply service. Where the requirements of an installation make it impracticable to conform to the maximum of 4 consumer services per supply service, Rule 6-104 allows the number of consumer services to exceed 4 if a deviation is granted under Rule 2-030. Multiple consumer services connected to one supply authority's service to a building can cause difficulty in emergencies. This occurs when all service boxes must be de-energized, creating an electrical hazard for personnel servicing and maintaining the building's electrical system, first responders, and/or emergency personnel. Time for an activity. Choose your response and then select Submit. Select to learn more. Rule 6-112 sets the minimum installation requirements for the attachment of overhead supply or consumer service conductors. The note in Appendix B helps to clarify Sub-Rule 1. This rule does not apply to an attachment point that is to be provided for conductors other than supply or consumer service conductors. Where an attachment point is provided for conductors other than supply service or consumer service conductors are required, the requirements are found in Sections 12, 54, or 60. Check with the supply authority for local clearances based on the installation location. Both the weight of snow and ice loads and the effects of high winds on the supply authorities or consumers' overhead service conductors can cause issues, such as conductors may sag, reducing the required ground clearance. Conductors may break. The supporting insulator may pull out of the wall or support structure, or the service mast may bend. Sub-Rule 2 lists 4 requirements for the point of attachments. On the building's same side as the consumer service head or equivalent, solidly anchored to the structure or service mast, in a position that allows the overhead service conductors or cables to angle away from the structure, and in compliance with the requirement of the supply authority. Sub-Rule 3 gives the heights above grade or sidewalk for clearance. The maximum is 9 meters, while the minimum varies, from 3.5 to 5.5 meters for the supply conductors running to the point of attachment, based on the area under the conductors. These areas can be streets, alleys, highways, driveways, and landscaped areas. The minimum clearance for exposed service conductors or cables is 1 meter from windows, doors, and porches, unless the conductors are installed above them. The minimum clearance for exposed service conductors and cables is 2.5 meters above an uncovered balcony or stairway. See Rule 12-310. Where service masts are used, they must be metal, assembled from components that are suitable for service mast use, and meet the requirements of the supply authority. Here you see components of an overhead service mast assembly. For example, when a consumer service does not exceed 200 amperes and 750 volts, and whose supply service span length is 30 meters or less, an overhead service mast assembly is permitted under certain conditions. For a consumer service that exceeds 200 amperes or is over 750 volts, or whose supply service span length is over 30 meters, or for non-standard mast installations, multiple masts supporting each other, additional engineering provisions may be required, and consultation with the inspection department and supply authority may be necessary. Picture of an angle iron mast that meets the supply authorities and inspection department's engineering specifications with the consumer service conduits and fittings installed and labeled with the code-required clearances. These conditions include when the maximum unguide projection of the support member does not exceed 1.5 meters, when the cantilever load does not exceed 270 kilograms, when 3 support clamps are used, the upper one being located at the roof line and the other 2 being installed on the wall of the building, when a roof plate is provided to prevent entrance of moisture, when the supply conductors are attached on the mast to comply with Rule 6-116, and lastly, when a clearance of not less than 950 millimeters is provided between the roof and the supply service attachment, except that the clearance may be reduced to 600 millimeters to the bottom of the drip loops. Time for an activity. Choose your response and then select Submit. Rule 6-114 sets the requirements and methods of terminating conductors or cables at consumer service. The requirements specify: connection between supply and service connectors must be suitable for the location, compression connection. Service heads must be suitable for wet locations. Exceptions from using service heads when continuous service cables are used. How to terminate and support continuous service cables to prevent the infiltration of moisture. That conductors of different polarities must use separate openings in the service head. The use of Rule 6-302, Item 3 to install consumer service conductors. And that the overhead supply service conductors and cables and the consumer service conductors are arranged as per Rule 6-116. Rule 6-116 sets the requirements for where a service head is to be located. The service head shall be located in a manner that does not present a fire or shock hazard, is accessible to the supply authority to allow connections to be made and maintained, does not allow water to enter the service conduit or cable or the service equipment, complies with the requirements of the supply authority, is at least 150 millimeters above the support for attachment of the overhead supply service conductors, is no more than 300 millimeters above the support for attachment of the overhead supply service conductors, and is no more than 600 millimeters horizontally from the support for attachment of the overhead service conductors or cables. In multiple occupancy and in single occupancy multi-rate service, each subdivision of the main consumer service shall be provided with a separate service box, or equivalent multi-service equipment shall be used. The exception is for single occupancy multi-rate services only. When a deviation is granted for single occupancy multi-rate services, the separate service box for each subdivision can be omitted, where the main consumer's service overcurrent devices adequately protect any subdivision of the main consumer's service. Personnel should have a safe and adequate working space when they service, operate, and maintain consumer service equipment. Rule 6-206 lists the requirements for the location of the consumer service equipment and specifies the locations that are not permitted. These locations include coal bins, where coal dust can cause short circuits in the panel because of tracking and can present a fire or explosion hazard; clothes closets, where access can be difficult and the contents of a closet can present a fire hazard; in bathrooms, moisture can cause shock hazards and deterioration of equipment; all areas where footing is not level, such as stairways; other dangerous or hazardous locations, which present a risk of fire or explosion. In areas with high temperature, heat can cause nuisance tripping of overcurrent devices and deterioration of insulation. In areas where the ceiling height is less than 2 meters, such areas are not easily accessible. And in any other undesirable location that presents a potential threat to the equipment or to personnel servicing the equipment. Time for an activity. Choose your response and then select Submit. When the service disconnecting means is installed outdoors, Rule 6-206 specifies the location and requires protection against environment and mechanical damage. Select to learn more. Rule 6-208 sets requirements for the location of consumer service conductors. Conductors located indoors require a greater degree of overcurrent protection than that provided by supply authorities for conductors located outdoors. The supply authority bases its protection on estimated demand. The protection on the line side of the supply transformer can supply multiple customers. Yet it is impractical to size the supply service conductors for the number of customers. As consumer service conductors are connected to the supply conductors, they should be treated as unprotected. To reduce the risk of a fire hazard to occupants and buildings, consumer service conductors should be run outside a building. However, when consumer service equipment is located inside the building, service conductors must enter the building for connection to the service box. The length of service conductors entering the building must be kept as short as practicable to minimize the risk of shock and fire hazard. The length must be verified with the authority having jurisdiction. Increased distances into the building can be accomplished by complying with the requirements of Rule 6-208 if it is impractical to locate the service box near the point of entry. In the example shown, the service box, meter base with main breaker, is mounted outside the dwelling in accordance with the authority having jurisdiction. Consumer service conductors are not provided with overcurrent protection other than that provided for the utility transformer primary. However, service equipment designed for accommodating current monitoring devices or other associated electrical equipment shall be permitted. Rule 6-212 Subrule 3 requires that such conductors not cross or contact conductors connected to the load side of the main switch or circuit breaker in a service box. To prevent unintentional or accidental contact, the supply and consumer service conductors are located either overhead or underground. However, the accessibility of the supply conductor installation for both the supply authority and the customer must be balanced with the need to limit exposure to live electrical energy. Rule 6-300 sets the requirements for the installation of underground consumer service conductors. Conductors shall be installed in rigid conduit or ENT for the underground portion, provided the conductors are approved for wet locations, or single or multi-conductor cables approved for service entrance below ground. Splices are permitted in all service conductors, including the neutral. Select to learn more. Rule 6-302 lists the approved wiring methods and requirements for the consumer service conductors located above ground at any point on a building or structure. Subrule 1 requires that consumer service conductors that are connected to an overhead supply service be installed in a raceway or be part of a cable assembly to provide mechanical protection, prevent contact with live parts, and limit damage to the structure or building if a fault occurs in the conductors. Subrule 1 lists the approved types of raceways and cables. Exposed cables in raceways must be protected from mechanical damage up to 2 meters above grade in accordance with Rule 12-934. Subrule 2 addresses consumer service conductors that are run exposed on the supply side of the consumer service head. When the conductors are run between buildings or on the outside walls of buildings, or when they cross over or are installed on the roof of a building. Subrule 3 requires that a minimum of 750 millimeters of conductor extend beyond the service head to accommodate for drip loops and connection to the supply authority's conductors. Subrule 4 requires that consumer service conductors be no smaller than 10-gauge copper or 8-gauge aluminum to provide mechanical strength and fault current carrying capability. Subrule 5 is intended to ensure that cables and conductors do not crack due to flexing in cold weather conditions, and that the insulation does not deteriorate as a result of ultraviolet rays from sunlight. See Rule 2-130. This subrule requires that the conductors be of a type and temperature rating suitable for local weather conditions. Subrule 5 is intended to ensure that cables and conductors do not crack due to flexing in cold weather conditions, and that the insulation does not deteriorate as a result of ultraviolet rays from sunlight. See Rule 2-130. This subrule requires that the conductors be of a type and temperature rating suitable for local weather conditions. Rule 6-310 prohibits joints and splices in the consumer service conductors. However, it is permitted to splice to comply with Rule 4-006 in service equipment, to repair damaged conductor, and to accommodate service relocation. Time for an activity. Choose your response and then select Submit. Rule 6-312 covers requirements for draining consumer service raceways. Water can cause corrosion, surface tracking, and equipment failure if allowed to enter the consumer's service box. Condensation in cold weather locations, when the service conduit enters a warm building from the cold outdoors, can also cause corrosion. The figure shows a drain hole drilled in a PVC LB fitting for drainage and an approved sealant that will not damage the insulation on the conductors inserted into the service conduit to prevent condensation from forming when the cold air outside the building enters it through the conduit. Select to learn more. A meter loop is a length of consumer service conductor that is left in the metering enclosure for the connection to the supply authority's metering equipment. To allow the supply authority to connect its metering equipment to the consumer service equipment, Subrule 1 items C and D require that a minimum of 450 millimeters of conductor be left at the meter or current transformer connection points, and a suitable fitting or a service box with a meter backplate be provided. Consult the supply authority for its metering requirements and the length of meter loop that must be left for its use. Rule 6-402, Item 2, requires metering equipment to be located on the load side of the service box. in order to be able to isolate the metering from energy during maintenance or repair. Metering is permitted on the supply side of the service box when the metering equipment and service type meet the requirements of Subrule 2. No live parts or wiring are exposed. Supply is AC and does not exceed 300 volts. And ampere rating does not exceed 200 amperes for an indoor or outdoor meter mounting device, 320 amperes for an indoor or outdoor meter mounting device equipment with a bypass means, or 600 amperes for a transformer-rated meter mounting device outdoors. Time for an activity. Choose your response and then select Submit.
Time for a scenario. Please read the scenario and follow the instructions to submit your answers.
Select to learn more. A meter loop is a length of consumer service conductor that is left in the metering enclosure for the connection to the supply authority's metering equipment. Metering equipment should be located as close as practicable to the service box, except if the meters are grouped together. The equipment must also be readily accessible, which means there will be adequate working space around electrical metering equipment, and the location should comply with the requirements of the supply authority. The metering equipment may not be installed in coal bins, clothes closets, bathrooms, stairways, rooms with high ambient temperatures, in dangerous or hazardous locations, or any other similar undesirable locations. Do the locations sound familiar? These are areas where consumer service equipment is also not permitted to be installed. There are various methods of metering impedance-grounded systems available to supply authorities. When the neutral of an impedance-grounded system is connected to ground through a neutral grounding device, the neutral grounding device should not be bypassed by the supply authority's metering.
You covered a lot in this course. This summary helps you to recall the main concepts and requirements of this code section. You have now completed the learning on the main concepts and requirements of this code section. Next, you will take the open